Greetings all. Just taking a sec to confirm everything's live and good to go. So I'm Daniel Foor. I think the sound and audio hopefully is good here on Facebook Live. And I want to introduce myself briefly first. Let me say what we're talking about. Sorry, pausing just to make sure that everything's good with the recording for another moment. Just waiting for a chime in on that. I do not, if folks are there, could you just give an echo back in the chat that everything's functional? I'm kind of used to that before recording. Super, thanks. So welcome everybody. It's October, I think 23rd, 2020, and the intent today is to share a bit about psychology and ritual and animism in advance of the Animist Psych course coming up. Starts in 2 weeks. And let me say a word briefly about where I'm speaking from. I'm here in Western North Carolina. It's traditional Tsalagi or Cherokee lands, and my own ancestors are English, Irish, German, early settler-colonialists in North America, and so that's where I'm speaking from. I'm a ritualist by profession. I'm also a doctor of psychology. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, although I'm not active with my clinical practice anymore. And I want to get into, for just a little bit, maybe 20 minutes, and we'll go to questions, the topic of the intersection of animist values or earth-honoring relational values with the field of psychology. So I've been sitting with for a minute. I wrote a kind of dissertation about a related topic, at least, use of so-called shamanic healing practices in a clinical mental health setting. And I care about both ritual arts and about psychology. And I have both of those kind of backgrounds. And so I sit a lot with how those two intersect or fail to. And animism, if you're not familiar with it, is one way of talking about a set of core values that affirms that living human people, we're just one kind of person in a much wider community or field or network of relationships. These other people are the ancestors, the dead who aren't really dead, the people who are the plants and animals and stones and rivers and deities and stars and spirits and all the different powers that you could imagine. And the premise is basically that those are other kinds of people, and that it behooves humans to seek to relate ethically with these other than human or other than visible human kin. And real community and society is not just including the humans, right? Certainly not all, but a lot of traditional indigenous frameworks see the world that way. And many of the 95% of humans who are not legally indigenous also see the world in that way. And so I'm also an animist. I wasn't raised with it, but I've come to deeply identify with and move from that place in the world. So what happens if you're an animist, even if you're a white guy from the US like I am, and you're also a clinician, you're also a psychology person? Well, what happens for a lot of people is you quietly kind of hide out, or you don't speak up when you're wearing your psychologist hat. And, well, that doesn't work. That's compartmentalizing. It's not congruent. And so what happens, first off, is that all of the clinical models and all of the treatment models reveal themselves to be the psychology of living humans' relationships with themselves and other living humans, which is cool. We have a lot of impact from and for the other relationships we have with living humans. And I enjoy, many other people enjoy relationships with the ancestors, the land, the deities, with folks who aren't human. Psychology, by and large, there are some exceptions, doesn't even consider that or touch on that much. And certainly the models of how a mental illness and the treatment of mental illness are conceptualized tend to not consider the influence of the other than humans, the influence of the land, of the ancestors, etc., on people's suffering or their happiness, for that matter. The etiology or the cause of mental emotional distress is typically not even considered to be from those sources. Because when we dig a little deeper, the worldview that gives rise to the field of psychology is largely Eurocentric. It's neither good nor bad. I don't have self-hatred toward myself as a person of European ancestries. Europe has been terrible toward a lot of other than European places on Earth in the last, especially 500 years, but white people don't have a monopoly on bad behavior, and that's a complicated historical, conversation in another moment. But the field of psychology has certainly emerged as a Eurocentric force in the world, for better or for worse. And beyond just saying Eurocentric, it also comes out of a modernist, rationalist, materialist strand of European culture, because Europe is super multicultural and not defined by the values that are reflected in the field of psychology. And when preparing for the course, I looked into the field, if you will, or the branch of indigenous psychology, thinking it would refer to indigenous peoples as I usually think of that. But instead it refers to folks in the field trying to advocate for, which I think is very useful, the local, regional articulations of psychology, whether it's Filipino psychology or Chinese psychology or Latino psychology or South African psychology, and basically saying that there are regional psychologies. And implicit in that is that there's not one normative regular psychology, that so-called regular psychology thing is actually Eurocentric or maybe European, American, Canadian, Australian centric, especially white people psychology. I say that with tremendous respect for the Black, Indigenous people of color who are also contributing to the diversification of the field, etc. So I'm not minimizing that, but I'm still largely European dominated. And so once we take psychology per se as a field and see it in a regular-sized way, to say, oh, this is a regional thing. Let us be mindful in how we impose this or not in other parts of the world. We start to create a space for a little bit of dialogue, and what would it take to recognize as a clinician, oh, your client could be experiencing ancestral impact in the present if the spirits of the dead are around them. They could be experiencing ill effect from the breaking of a taboo of dishonoring the water spirits where they live. They could have a other dimensional, like soul obligation that they're failing to fulfill that's causing them to be depressed. To even start to think in those pathways requires a different kind of epistemology. And that, I know, is a kind of a technical philosophical word. I'm not a philosopher per se, but it refers to the study of knowledge and what kinds of knowledge are admissible or allowed for and respected within any given culture. And psychology as a field tends to really want to be in the hard sciences, empirical, super accepted club, like chemistry and biology and physics, and to struggle with this soft sciences reputation. And I think it's a losing battle to be in that club, so to speak. And it matters because if the field is invalidating other epistemologies, animist epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, that allow for things like communication through dreams, or direct perception of the spirits, or synchronicity, precognition, and not direct knowing through ritual, for example. Those other ways of knowing in many, many parts of the world are also legitimate ways of directly knowing. And when the field of psychology, meaning the predominantly Eurocentric field, even if there are diversely ancestored bodies, the underlying value set is growing out of European rationalism and materialism. If it's like that, and there's an encounter with these other ways of knowing, then there are a few different ways that can move. It can either be like, oh, that's a different set of assumptions. My set of assumptions are neither better nor worse, but interesting, let us dialogue. Or, more commonly, the Eurocentric psych-trained person will tend to double down on their view of the world and be like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but that seems a little bit spiritual or religious. Therefore, it's outside the domain of working with the human psyche or psychological healing, or that's irrational and not scientific. As soon as it starts to go in that direction, psychology as it exists now is then also replicating the whole boatload of colonialist, racist, classist garbage that really is indicative of European empire, white supremacy, and those particular kinds of harms. Because it's saying if you believe in the spirits, if you are into that kind of stuff, unless maybe if you're an indigenous person or if you're from a culture like that, then maybe it's okay under cross-cultural psych. But if you're like a white guy that believes in the spirits, you've got mental health problems. And so once that kind of judgmental view, or the view that such things are outside the appropriate domain of study for psychology, comes into play, it's an unconscious, typically unconscious replication of, like I said, the racist colonialist project and the empire building project. So that's a bit technical in a sense to get into that layer of epistemology. But what happens if we don't name it, and we're trying to bridge these two bodies of knowing, of what's really beneficial and awesome about the field of psych, because there are really good things. There's a lot of people I've known over the years involved in ritual and ceremony and spirituality who could really do with some good therapy. Like, they have a lot of wounding. And I continue to do my own inner work. I'm not saying I'm perfect. Like, everybody's a work in progress. I don't say it from this arrogant stance, but just being involved in ritual and just talking to the dead and channeling the deities doesn't make you emotionally worked through and ethical necessarily. And so I actually have a ton of respect for the field of psych. So when we hold these two in conversation, in order to start to make that bridge where there can be real sharing of like, hey, what are you finding that's helping people? What are you finding? Let us learn from each other. There needs to be a recognition that the tension between those two frames runs really deep, and it has to do with what ways of knowing are culturally sanctioned and allowed for. As soon as someone who's conditioned, whether or not they're a student of psychology per se, you could be a therapy client, you could be someone who's just like reading a self-help book, whatever. As soon as someone is asked to question the very the topic of what is real and what kind of knowledge is allowed for, that can be really destabilizing, be vulnerable. Because what happens is suddenly the whole field of psychology reveals itself as like pathologically incomplete in a way that's really doing fresh damage by replicating a map of the world that reinforces our loneliness. And it reinforces our isolation. It reinforces illusions like nature. Like there's something different than humans, it's nature. One of the real devastating problems with the rationalist materialist frame that invalidates the personhood of the other than human people, of our kin, is that it leaves us perceptually in a world where we're very alone, and is very sad. And people can work their whole life to preserve nature or protect the environment, which is awesome, like let's do that, and never actually talk to and hear back from the trees or the stones or the rivers that they're working to protect. They're not actually in dialogue with the woodpeckers and the bees and all of them. And so we're still in that bubble of extreme individualism and anthropocentrism, like human isolation. The value set, which is not limited to just indigenous peoples, that is animism, that affirms that we're one kind of person in a big network. There are reframes to psychology that follow from that if we carry that value set into the conversation and into the field of psychology. When we do that, there's a need to recognize, for example, that humans aren't the only ones with psyches. If we're studying the psyche, the soul, the self, the psyche, something like that, in psychology, of course, the root of the word, I have a license in the state of California. It's currently inactive because I'm not using it, to work with the human psyche as a psychotherapist, right? So to provide therapy for the psyche. And nobody ever once in my training, and I went to weird progressive schools, suggested to me that people other than humans also have psyches. What is the psyche of the Swannanoa River here? What's the psyche of the ancestors that I'm honoring on the shrine behind me? Or the copper and metal and plastics that are mediating this conversation? Or the earth, or the systems that we're either enjoying or trying to change? Like that these other than human forms and people have not just a kind of personhood status that we ought to like recognize their existence, but they also have their complex motivations and desires and histories and agency and all of that. That isn't being talked about hardly at all in the field. And the fact that it's not means that the people being empowered by the culture, let's say in the United States, to legally and clinically work with human suffering are unconsciously replicating the view that humans are essentially kind of alone in the universe. With the exception maybe of nature as a therapeutic thing, or companion animals, or service animals, or emotional support animals, which is fine. I don't mean to judge that, but it's like emotional support wildflowers and stones and planets and wind and emotional support elements that we're made out of. And in that way, we start to get like, what are we talking about? It's useful to use that as a launching, as a stepping off point to talk about how coming back into relationship with life is emotionally beneficial. And also it is, from someone who's already been living from that relationally embedded stance, it looks like a kind of young stance because we're still relating with the other than humans as a kind of emotional support crutch, or like, it's good for me to get out in nature. I don't mean to laugh at it. Like, it actually is good for me to get out, but it's different than saying, my soul is fed by spending time with the others and going to spend time in their neighborhood and to listen to what's happening with them and to remember my accountability to them. So beyond just like, this helps me to feel less depressed, what are my responsibilities to the earth, to the dead? Those are conversations that are really just kind of normal in a lot of cultures on earth. And they're ones that the field of psychology by and large doesn't have a good framework to even participate in. Let's start to open it up for questions. If anybody's got questions that are here. In the course that's coming up, we'll be diving into these kinds of themes and then getting applied or practical and specific about it around topics like trauma and resilience, and identifying and healing trauma is super important. And if we frame it as a human-only kind of thing, then we're at risk of replicating it. In the United States here in late 2020, before our impactful and hopefully auspicious election soon, and just in a year of several 100,000 additional people dying and a lot of stress, one of the things that feels as clear to me as ever is that we're in a culture, and I'm generalizing, there's a lot of different people here from lots of places with lots of values, but generally speaking, the national ethos is trends toward really extreme individualism. And whew, it's a tough kind of energy to be with. And it's one that doesn't tend to recognize or legitimize the many others that are part of our lives and weighing on us and impacting us at any given time. And those dialogues, those considerations are needed for the field of psych to start to even know how to learn from older psychologies, indigenous or otherwise. Yeah, that's most of what I want to say by way of an intro. Again, there's an invitation in the chat if you hear you have a question to ask a thing. If not, I'll pause and see if there are other things that feel supportive to add, and then share just a little bit about the course that's coming up. And it starts in 2 weeks, but we'll pause for just a moment. I don't see questions in this moment, so let me say a thing about the course, which is that it's an 8-lesson course. The 8 lessons come out once a week, one each week, and they're about an hour to an hour and a half long. And each of them, I see a question, I'll get to it in just a second. Each of them are accompanied by a pretty abundant resources section from people other than me. And in addition to each of the 8 lessons, we have 4 different optional calls each week. One is Q&A with me. You can also send in questions if you want. And the other 3 are anchored by people I've trained with, or that I've trained in guiding ritual. So people I know, and people of good character and good background for the work. And those calls also include a 35-minute small breakout where we aim for a ratio of 7 to 12 people probably. And so there's time for over half an hour in each of those to discuss directly with peers what you're learning in the course. And those 3 calls happen in East, South Asian, Australia-friendly time zone, North America-friendly, and Europe-friendly time zone for international inclusivity. And they include options for BIPOC and LGBTQ-only breakout spaces if that's supportive for anybody. So there's a lot of opportunity to interact with one another, and information on the website with Ancestral Medicine about all that if you're drawn to it. But let me take a glance here at the questions that are coming through. Somebody asks as I'm talking, I wonder if this relational dissociation from other humans and the other than humans is a symptom and a reenactment of collective trauma and traumas of various kinds. Oh, for sure. I mean, look, everybody on Earth, myself included, is descended from people who at one point were living in a more relational way with the land and the spirits and the other than humans. Now, relational doesn't mean you're ethical or friendly about it, but it means that you at least take into account the reality of the waters and the dead and the plants and the gods, and we're not alone in the universe. And for my own lineages, it's been over 1,000 years at least in any direction that the people on Earth were enacting an animist framework. And in one sense, that is a long time. It's at least 20 generations of people that have a cultural amnesia about the larger accountability to life, even though they might be very ethical people in a lot of ways. And on the other hand, it's less than 1% of our history as a species. So the vast majority of our ancestors, even if you're from the most historically tangled up people you could possibly be from, which is pretty close as like a northern Western European white guy, and even if that's the case, the dead are very available, including the older ones. And so they can absolutely inform what is needed to rekindle those connections. But is it intergenerational, the disconnect? Absolutely. And it can all, the intergenerationality or the ancestral connection to make it more relational, can also be the medicine as well as the diagnosis of the trouble. Somebody asked me not so long ago, how do you distinguish what's personal, what's cultural when you're talking about healing? I'm like, well, let's start from the assumption that it's all cultural. Meaning, if I uproot or transform or identify and work with in my life and in my world the sexism, the classism and elitism, the colonialism, the racism, the disconnection from the earth, and the extremism and the religious attitudes, if I work out that, what's left? I might be kind of just annoying in some other certain way, but so much of what we're down lineage from is what is being worked with in therapy. It's one of the, methodologically, it's one of the ways that psychotherapy, I think, sometimes doesn't always serve people well, when it reinforces the individualism and it tends to locate the problem within the person. In one sense, that encourages self-responsibility. That's great. It's important that we know that we have agency to change things within ourselves. And also those things that we're transforming and healing, they're bigger systemic poisons and troubles. And so, yeah, it's all cultural in that sense. But great. Thanks for the question. I see another question. How do we deepen our relationships with our other than human kin? My family and I begin to talk out loud to them and welcome more relationships. Any other tips or advice on how to do this, including with young children? Yeah, speaking aloud to them is great. And of course, I know the person writing in has participated in some of the animism courses and all that. The main thing I would say to parents is model it, live it, and be really open about it. In my time, for example, in Nigeria, trips there, the kids are involved in the ritual. Almost all of it. They're around it. It's normalized. Like, oh, the people are worshiping Ogun today, and we're going to spray some gin on the engine of the car while we're praying to Ogun. Great. Let me go grab something else that's needed for it. So involve the kids in ritual if you can, and have it be a really normal thing. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm praying to the ancestors. Well, and then her daughter, for example, she's almost 3, would be like, I want to pray for this, pray for that, pray for. Okay, I'll pray for that too. So speaking aloud to them is great. Another is remembering that so much of the relational tending with the other than humans in a lot of cultures around the world is usefully understood as etiquette or politeness and respect. And in that way, like our was in the stroller earlier today with our kid, and she wanted to get this fuzzy plant, and I'm like, you got to ask, and really ask her, like, listen, is it a yes or a no? And she's like, oh, I think it's a yes. I'm like, okay, so what do you say? Thank you. And then we took a little piece of the plant. And it's important that she knows that she can also hear no as well. And so those kind of basic etiquette questions, and having them watch you model it, that's a good one. And it encourages a consent-based culture with other living humans as well. So in that way, a final thing I'd say is remember that whatever kind of politeness or etiquette or respect for boundaries and attentiveness to others' needs that you enact with other living humans, do that with the other than humans as well, and help the kids to see that you're not really relating with them differently, that they're all people. One other thing, actually, is if you can, raise them bilingual. Kids that have another language at home, and one where they really have to use it sometimes, almost always, what the studies have shown is that they tend to more quickly be able to read what the world around them wants from them. And I think when you learn a second language, especially as a young person, you're really getting a third language. And that's the language that is the thing behind the words. If you notice a tree or audible in Spanish, for example, then you have tree, you have audible, and then you have this kind of mysterious thing that you might not know the German or Russian word for it, but you recognize that there's another dynamic, mysterious thing that can respond to different names. And so, yeah, like that. But animism in a relational way really hinges on being able to assume different perspectives. And so imaginative play, where you help children to know how to pretend to be a bear. And okay, when you're pretending to be a bear, what do you want? What do you need? It's that same skill if it's your job to communicate with the bear spirits in your neighborhood. If someone knows how to imagine their way into bear consciousness, then you're close to communicating with bear. It's a setup for that last step. So, good. I see a few other questions, so I'll hang out for another moment. Yeah, for people who are in a more urban environment, how do you help people to develop the connection with the other than human world there? It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer on it. But what I would say is the first thing, because it's not always going to be possible to go out and so all the programs that help people to get out and all the ways you can get out of the human-shaped environments, that's great. People should have that opportunity if at all possible. And practically in any given moment, on any given day, it may not be possible. And so as an educator, break down the human nature split within yourself so that you see that everything happening, including this weird Facebook thing we're communicating through, or the internet, or however it is, even these things are nature. Even the human-shaped things are dynamic. They're not owned by us. They're the children of human and the elements, if you will. And that the plants in one's home or neighborhood are elder, complex beings and powers that can be communicated with. The metals in one's home, to understand their origins in the earth and the specific kind of songs that they're emanating with, or the petroleum in the plastics in the phone charger cord, and to be able to see that there's nothing outside the system, and to really know how to activate that in a way that's interesting for others. You need to sink into it yourself a bit, and to not unconscious, because what you can do, if you, without even realizing it, is bring this, like someone's already fine, they're kind of connected and they're feeling well, and you bring this perception into their world that they're missing out on something. And on one hand they are, but you're also saying, oh, there's this thing called nature, and it isn't here, and you're missing it. And in a way that just worsens someone's condition. And so ideally you want to help them to see the sacred in what's right beneath them, including their own body. That's kind of the point. But thanks, it's a great question. I see another question. I'll glance here. How does the Course talk to tending the journey between reconnection and resilience to the harshness of current times? Yeah, there's the times are challenging, and depending, everybody's got different circumstances, and likely to become more intense and more challenging, at least for the next 50 to 100 years. So probably everybody alive listening to this now is in for it for the rest of your life, at least. Because that's, I mean, we have pockets of comfort and hopefulness and all that, but things are going to get more turbulent for a bit. I don't have a super cynical, fatalistic attitude about that, but that's just a read on the population and the earth and the climate change and the trajectory. Like, we're in for a ride. There's no way around that. So the stance is to see your life just as it is, your conditions just as they are. That doesn't mean we're not working for them to be better. It doesn't mean there isn't injustice or like things that flood us. But the conditions just as they are the place where we need to make the magic from. Those are the ingredients. Those are the inputs. And if we're living always in a stance of like, man, if I could just be camping, or if I could just get out to the river like every morning, then I would be okay. We're never going to get there. Like the perfect conditions aren't going to come. And I struggle with that myself. I'm sure everybody does in their own way of like, if things were just X, then I would be all right. Then I would be happy. And so we will talk about trauma and resilience, and we'll talk about things like possession, curses, what's good and not so good about eco-psychology, or belonging, like how do you cultivate a sense of belonging and connection to the land where you're at, and about personality and how that can work for and against us. And mostly I want to take what's really awesome about psychology, because there's a lot of awesome things, and bridge that into this whole other terrain of these other people. And at the same time, take some of the juiciest bits of animist theory and practice and bridge that into what's actually going on with psychology. And so we'll get as deep into that as we can get in about 10 to 12 hours of recorded teaching and a bunch of dialogue. Yeah. Thanks. And let me see if there's another question or two. I see. Oh, I think I lost one. Anybody else? Final call for questions? Yeah, I don't see any others right now. I know, last thing is, I know that my way of speaking of things sometimes can be a little bit technical or like nerdy intellectual in a way. And for some people, it might be like, that's great, that's enjoyable. And for other people, it might be like, cool, but do you have to make it so esoteric? And it's the intent with the course that it be really truly accessible to people of any background, whether or not you are training or formally involved in the field of psychology. There are more technical resources if that's interesting to you, but I want to be clear that the course is for general audience. There's no required thing, no prerequisites. There are experiential practices with each lesson, so it's not only theoretical. And I see two other questions. Well, we do have a moment, so let me go to that. Will I be delving into practices of shape-shifting, ritual, inhabiting of other than human consciousness? No, not really. We'll be exploring topics like malevolence and evil and your connection with I'm inviting people in the course in the experiential practices to basically try on these different lenses as if psychology really did have this stance, as if the world did have this inclusivity of relationships, and then to review your life a bit through that lens. Who have you already been relating with that you haven't necessarily recognized as such? What are the other human powers that are actually not so great that you've had connection with? And so a lot of the experiential work, in a way, is about taking this tendency to like culturally gaslight ourselves or culturally deny and minimize our own experience based on the dominant paradigm that dismisses those things, and to shift that up by giving ourselves permission to honor what we've already been experiencing. And we'll talk a little bit about, establishing healthy boundaries and stuff like that, but the course is a little bit emphasized toward things that are challenging or troubling, but not only that. And the question comes, will I offer advice or rituals for healing troubled relationships with humans or conditions or humans or ancestors? Yes, a little bit. It'll be a topic that's welcome. It's not an explicit topic so much. The content of the 8 lessons are mapped out on the landing page, so that gives some feel for it. The ancestral lineage healing and practical animism courses that I also guide and that are available through Ancestral Medicine speak to that a bit more, especially the ancestral healing course. But it'll be a welcome but not foreground topic in this course. It's implicit in the sense that a lot of the ways that relationships become troubled in the first place are because we don't have a framework for even navigating that kind of relationship, because no one ever helped us to have one, or we don't have support. We don't have any like, maybe we have a little bit of a framework, but then we don't have anyone holding a safe and supportive container to actually address whatever it is. So we do speak about what it is to have a safe container for these kinds of engagements. So good. But it's not a course per se on how to just start relating with the spirits and the dead and the deities. You may already bring that experience to the course, or it's something you could choose to start to engage by just the nature of what we're talking about. Finally, I want to appreciate all the people within and around the field of psychology who are already doing this kind of thing and who already have been. There are some people, maybe traditional indigenous people, who are also clinicians or psychologists around the world. Some people may be pagan ritualist people. There might be different kinds of deeply religious people of whatever background, people who are just tapped into the earth and the dead and things like that, who are already explicitly or in a low-key way embodying these kinds of things. I don't have the view that what I'm doing is somehow unique or that others aren't doing it. I just feel positioned through my training and my background and life experience to be able to speak to a thing and hopefully create a little bit more space for people to openly do what they're already doing and to expect better when they're a therapy client, and in general just to do more psychologically whole and healed versions of their lives and their participation in different communities of practice. So that's the intent, and we'll have a good time with the course, and there's a lot of options we have by way of scholarships to keep the work accessible. And I believe the registration stays open a bit after the start of the course, so into mid-November or so. It's our first time offering it, so I'm actually very excited about it. And the lessons they're substantive. They're over an hour long each, and so it's been a delight to try to download what has been percolating for probably 20 years about these topics. So thank you all. Thanks to the ancestors, to my own teachers, and those who have helped me to be able to do a thing. And I hope you consider joining us. And for more info, just check out ancestralmedicine.org. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time and engagement.